a widow with a very good fortune, and my cousin, Mr Ffoulkes, married her, and it was all owing to her two little Fs. Mrs Fitz-Adam did not stand a chance of meeting with a Mr Fitz-anything in Cranford, so that could not have been her motive for settling there. Miss Matty thought it might have been the hope of being admitted into the society of the place, which would certainly be a very agreeable rise for ci devant Miss Hoggins, and if this had been her hope, it would be cruel to disappoint her. So everybody called upon Mrs Fitz-Adam, everybody but Mrs Jamieson, who used to show how honourable she was by never seeing Mrs Fitz-Adam when they met at the Cranford parties. There would be only 8 or 10 ladies in the room, and Mrs Fitz-Adam was the largest of all, and she invariably used to stand up when Mrs Jamieson came in, and curtsy very low to her whenever she turned in her direction; so low, in fact, that I think Mrs Jamieson must have looked at the wall before her, for she never moved a muscle of her face, no more than if she had not seen her. Still, Mrs Fitz-Adam persevered. The spring evenings were getting bright and long when 3 or 4 ladies in calashes met at Miss Barker's door. Do you know what a calash is? It is a covering worn over caps, not unlike the heads fastened on old-fashioned gigs, but sometimes it is not quite so large. This kind of headgear always made an awful impression on the children in Cranford, and now 2 or 3 left off their play in the quiet little sunny street, and gathered in wondering silence round Miss Pole, Miss Matty, and myself. We were silent too, so that we could hear loud, suppressed whispers inside Miss Barker's house. "Wait, Peggy, wait till I've run upstairs and washed my hands. When I cough, open the door. I'll not be a minute." And true enough, it was not a minute before we heard a noise, between a sneeze and a crow, on which the door flew open. Behind it stood a round-eyed maiden, aghast at the honourable company of calashes, who marched in without a word. She recovered presence of mind enough to usher us into a small room, which had been the shop, but was now converted into a temporary dressing-room. There we unpinned and shook ourselves, and arranged our features before the glass and sweet gracious company face, and then, bowing backwards with "After you, ma'am," we allowed Mrs Forrester to take precedence up the narrow staircase that led to Miss Barker's drawing-room. There she sat, stately and composed as though we had never heard that odd-sounding cough, from which her throat must have been even then sore and rough. Kind, gentle, shabbily dressed Mrs Forrester was immediately conducted to the second place of honour, a seat arranged something like Prince Albert's near the Queen's, good, but not so good. The place of pre-eminence was, of course, reserved for the Honourable Mrs Jamieson, who presently came panting up the stairs, Carlo rushing round her on her progress, as if he meant to trip her up. And now Miss Betty Barker was a proud and happy woman. She stirred the fire, shut the door, and sat as near to it as she could, quite on the edge of her chair. When Peggy came in, tottering under the weight of the tea-tray, I noticed that Miss Barker was sadly afraid lest Peggy should not keep her distance sufficiently. She and her mistress were on very familiar terms in their everyday intercourse, and Peggy wanted now to make several little confidences to her, which Miss Barker was on thorns to hear, but which she thought it her duty, as a lady, to repress. So she turned away from all Peggy's asides and signs, but she made 1 or 2 very mal-propos answers to what was said, and at last, seized with a bright idea, she exclaimed, "Poor sweet Carlo! I'm forgetting him. Come downstairs with me, poor itty doggy, and it shall have its tea, it shall." In a few minutes she returned, bland and benignant as before, but I thought she had forgotten to give the poor itty doggy anything to eat, judging by avidity with which it swallowed down pieces of cake. The tea-tray was abundantly loaded. I was pleased to see it, I was so hungry, but I was afraid the ladies present might think it vulgarly heaped up. I know they would have done at their own houses, but somehow the heaps disappeared here. I saw Mrs Jamieson eating seed cake, slowly and considerably, as she did everything, and I was rather surprised, for I know she had told us, on the occasion of her last party, that she never had it in her house, it reminded her so much of scented soap. She always gave us Savoy biscuits. However, Mrs Jamieson was kindly indulgent to Miss Barker's want of knowledge of the customs of high life, and to spare her feelings, ate 3 large pieces of seed cake, with a placid, ruminating expression of countenance not unlike a cow's. After tea there was some little demur and difficulty. We were 6 in number, 4 could play at preference, and for the other 2 there was cribbage. But all, except myself, I was rather afraid of the Cranford ladies at cards, for it was the most earnest and serious business they ever engaged in, were anxious to be of the pool. Even Miss Barker, while declaring she did not know spadille from Medill, was evidently hankering to take a hand. The dilemma was soon put to an end by a singular kind of noise. If a baron's daughter-in-law could ever be supposed to snore, I should have said Mrs Jamieson did so then; for, overcome by the heat of the room, and inclined to doze by nature, the temptation of that very comfortable arm-chair had been too much for her, and Mrs Jamieson was nodding. Once or twice she opened her eyes with an effort, and calmly but unconsciously smiled upon us; but by and by, even her benevolence was not equal to this exertion, and she was sound asleep. "It is very gratifying to me," whispered Miss Barker at the card-table to her three opponents, whom, notwithstanding her ignorance of the game, she was basting most unmercifully, "very gratifying indeed, to see how completely Mrs Jamieson feels at home in my poor little dwelling. She could not have paid me a greater compliment." Miss Barker provided me with some literature in the shape of 3 or 4 handsomely bound fashion books 10 or 12 years old, observing, as she put little table and candle for my especial benefit, that she knew young people liked to look at pictures. Carlo lay and snorted, and stared at his mistress's feet. He, too, was quite at home. The card-table was an animated scene to watch; 4 ladies' heads, with niddle-nodding caps, all nearly meeting over the middle of the table in their eagerness to whisper quick enough and loud enough, and every now and then came Miss Barker's "Hush, ladies, if you please, hush! Mrs Jamieson is asleep." It was very difficult to steer clear between Mrs Forrester's deafness and Mrs Jamieson's sleepiness, but Miss Barker managed her arduous task well. She repeated the whisper to Mrs Forrester, distorting her face considerably, in order to show by the motions of her lips what she said, and then she smiled kindly round at us, and murmured to herself, "Very gratifying indeed. I wish my poor sister had been alive to see this day." Presently the door was thrown wide open; Carlo started to his feet, with a loud snapping bark, and Mrs Jamieson awoke, or perhaps she had not been asleep, as she said almost directly; the room had been so light she had been glad to keep her eyes shut, but had been listening with great interest to all our amusing and agreeable conversation. Peggy came in once more, red with importance. "Another tray! Oh, gentility!" thought I, "can yon endure this last shock?" For Miss Barker had ordered, nay, I doubt not prepared, although she did say, "Why, Peggy, what have you brought us?" and looked pleasantly surprised at the unexpected pleasure, all sorts of good things for supper: scalloped oysters, potted lobsters, jelly, a dish called little Cupids, which was in great favour with the Cranford ladies, although too expensive to be given, except on solemn and state occasions; macaroons, sopped in brandy, I should have called it, if I had not known its more refined and classical name. In short, we were evidently to be feasted with all that was sweetest and best, and we thought it better to submit graciously, even at the cost of our gentility, which never ate suppers in general, but which, like most non-supper eaters, was particularly hungry on all special occasions. Miss Barker, in her former sphere, had, I daresay, been made acquainted with the beverage they call cherry brandy. We none of us had ever seen such a thing, and rather shrank back when she offered it to us. "Just a little glass, ladies, after the oysters and lobsters, you know." Shellfish are sometimes thought not very wholesome. We all shook our heads like female mandarins, but at last Mrs Jamieson suffered herself to be persuaded, and we followed her lead. It was not exactly unpalatable, though so hot and strong that we thought ourselves bound to give evidence that we were not accustomed to such things by coughing terribly, almost as strangely as Miss Barker had done, before we were admitted by Peggy. "It's very strong," said Miss Pole, as she put down her empty glass. "I do believe there's spirit in it." "Only a little drop, just necessary to make it keep," said Miss Barker. "You know we put pepper brandy over our preserves to make them keep. I often feel tipsy myself from eating damson tart." I question whether damson tart would have opened Mrs Jamieson's heart as the cherry brandy did, but she told us of a coming event, respecting which she had been quite silent till that moment. "My sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, is coming to stay with me." There was a chorus of "Indeed!" and then a pause. Each one rapidly reviewed her wardrobe, as to its fitness to appear in the presence of a baron's widow; for, of course, a series of small festivals were always held in Cranford on the arrival of a visitor at any of our friends' houses. We felt pleasantly excited on the present occasion. Not long after this the maids and the lanterns were announced. Mrs Jamieson had the sedan chair, which had squeezed itself into Miss Barker's narrow lobby with some difficulty, and most literally stopped the way. It required some skilful manoeuvring on the part of the old chairmen, shoemakers by day, but when summoned to carry the sedan